Our guest today has all the blessings and curses associated with running this wonderful city. First elected mayor in 2003, David Miller was re-elected in 2006. Mr. Miller has made it very clear that his mission as mayor is to make Toronto the economic engine of this province and in many ways Canada, a city of prosperity and opportunity for all. In his first term, he was instrumental in securing the New Deal for Cities and Communities, a series of agreements between Toronto's government as well as those of Canada's other urban centres, the governments of Ontario and Canada, which provided Toronto with more money and a seat at the table. Congratulations, Mayor. Mayor Miller formalized prosperity as a mission this term. In June of 2006, he formed the committee of which you've met some of his members, the Economic Competitiveness Advisory Committee, and this report was delivered to him just this past month. His committee brought together a high-profile and talented group of leaders to advise him on how to improve the quality of life in Toronto. I'm pleased to note that about half of that group was able to join us today. The vision statement of this committee paints a picture of what we all want this great city to be. It's 2015 and Toronto has established a reputation as the model city for global competitiveness, a vibrant, forward-thinking local economy, the envy of its peers, a ranking as the top city in the world for job creation and employment attraction, being touted worldwide as the place to be. This is what Toronto could become in the next 10 years, but to reach that goal, there's work to be done, and it must be done as a community guided by shared vision and common sense of purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Worship David Miller, Mayor of Toronto.
Thanks very much, Alan, for that kind introduction, and everyone for that very warm welcome. I would like to acknowledge the members of my Economic Competitiveness Advisory Committee who are here at the head table and thank them for their work, and also acknowledge some other members who I see, Carol Wilding from the Board of Trade, for example, City Councillor Kyle Ray, who's chair of our Economic Development and Culture Committee. The committee has achieved an extraordinary amount, and for those viewers at home, I do want to show the agenda for prosperity. It's a very important strategy from my perspective for how Toronto is going to move forward for the next decades. And one of the things that was very important about this strategy for me was the fact that the committee that produced it was not a committee of City Hall, it was a committee of Toronto. And we had business leaders, labour leaders, elected officials, leaders from our cultural and educational institutions. And they came together with a common purpose, and a pretty simple one. And that common purpose was the idea that Toronto's been incredibly successful over the years, but we can't take that success for granted. And if we are going to succeed in the future, we need a clear strategy, and everyone has a part to play in that. Business, labour, government, cultural institutions, and of course our great academic institutions, which is what the agenda for prosperity is all about. And I'll get to the details in a moment, but I just want to step back because it's taken us about 10 years to get to this point. And Toronto's a city that's been around a long time, so we sort of forget that it was just over 10 years ago that this particular city of Toronto was created at the time of amalgamation. And those 10 years have been pretty challenging, to say the least. At the time of amalgamation was extremely difficult, just the process of amalgamation. Of course, there was downloading. There was some significant challenges, like the MFP inquiry, which revealed some very serious problems at City Hall. And from my perspective, one of the big challenges that the city faced was there wasn't a clear agenda or a clear vision driving how the city government of Canada's largest and most important city and Canada's sixth largest government was going to succeed. So when I sought to become mayor, I made a pledge to change that. And one of the campaign ads that I ran said that Torontonians could live in a magnificent city without having to move. Didn't mention hair or anything like that at all. And really that ad summed up for me what we were trying to do collectively, was take a city that is an extraordinary place, but build on its tremendous strengths to make it the magnificent, successful, prosperous city that we know it can be, and moreover, it should be. And I'm very proud of the steps that we've taken since 2003 in order to do that. And I think this year, 2008, marks a critical turning point. First of all, for the first time since amalgamation, we have a balanced budget of $8.2 billion. It's taken a decade, but I'm proud that we've balanced our budget, and I do want to acknowledge the work of Councillor Carroll and Councillor Ray in that regard. Now, that balanced budget was made possible because of a lot of work, some of which Alan referred to. The New Deal for cities, the share of the gas tax from the federal and provincial governments to support public transit, the City of Toronto Act, which has allowed the city the ability to govern itself much more effectively, the uploading of the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan, Ontario Disability Support Program by the province, the very difficult decision the city took to introduce a land transfer tax, and of course the GST exemption from the federal government. All of these things resulted from a deliberate decision we made for Toronto to take a leadership role on the national and the regional stage. And from the very first moment I became mayor, I made intergovernmental relations one of my top priorities because it is essential. If Toronto's going to succeed, and frankly if Canada is going to succeed, Toronto has to show leadership in this way. A lot of those things came to fruition in this year's budget, but of course a balanced budget isn't about balancing numbers. It's about the investments that you choose to make in a city. And what we're trying to do at the City of Toronto is invest strategically with still limited resources to create prosperity, livability, and opportunity for every single Torontonian. Not just some, all Torontonians. That's what I said I would do when I ran for re-election, and that's what my mandate is. And they all go hand in hand. Prosperity creates opportunity. Opportunity makes a city livable. And of course, a livable city is a prosperous city. And I know that Torontonians understand that. And I think Torontonians also understand, perhaps more than others, that the world today is becoming a much more urban place. Things happen in cities. This year, for the first time ever, more than half of the world's population will be in cities. More than half of Canada's total population lives in the country's 10 largest city regions. And 90% of the population growth in this century in Canada takes place in those 10 cities. 90%. So cities are where things are happening in the 21st century. And the success of cities is going to determine the success or failure of nations, in my view. And of course, that means that Canada is not going to succeed without Toronto succeeding and showing leadership. And that's what the prosperity agenda is all about. It's based on that idea that in a global economy, we cannot take our economic success for granted. We must act, and we must act now. The agenda is built on 4 pillars: proactive Toronto, global Toronto, creative Toronto, and last, but certainly not least, one Toronto. And I'll speak about those pillars for a few minutes, and then I'm going to link in some of the things we're doing at Toronto City Hall to support this strategy and to make it real. Proactive Toronto is about the role that city government can play in helping facilitate the creation of wealth, but it's also about the proactive role that business must play in investing in our city and in business opportunities in this city. It has to be a partnership. Business will succeed when the city succeeds, and vice versa. So some of the things we're doing, we've brought in a new program of tax equivalent incentive grants, which is a terrible name, but it's a name for using our commercial tax system to in effect give breaks to businesses who are redeveloping, for example, brownfield sites to create jobs and opportunity. I'm very proud to say that strategy passed City Council unanimously last November. We have a new concierge service. So when there is an application that has important job creation opportunities, a civil servant is designated to assist the development applicant through our process at City Hall to make sure that those jobs can actually happen. And we have tax cuts for businesses. Now, everybody speaks and knows about the land transfer tax. It was some discussion about it publicly. But there's very little said about the fact that this City Council has lowered the rate of business taxes every year since I was elected mayor. The high rate of commercial taxes in Toronto has been an issue with respect to the 905 for probably 50 years. It took 50 years to develop, and we've addressed it, and I'm very proud of that. But I would like to go back to the land transfer tax for just a second. It was a very difficult decision for Council to use the powers granted to the city by the new City of Toronto Act to raise the revenues that are necessary to support the city. But it was the right thing to do, and our 2008 budget shows why. And I want to applaud my colleagues in Council who showed great courage in supporting those new revenues, and the investments they're going to make in Toronto are going to pay off more and more. Those investments pay off best when they're done in the spirit of partnership with the business community and with our academic community and others. And I'll give a simple example. BMO Field. Very proud of what we accomplished there. The City of Toronto invested $10 million to build a soccer stadium valued at $70 million. At the time, there was some criticism. I thought it was a pretty good deal. Anytime I can buy something worth $70 million for $10 million, I think I'm happy to do it. But it's been an extraordinary success. Look what it did for Toronto last year. We brought the world to our city for the Under-20 World Cup. And it was the most successful Under-20 World Soccer Championship in the history of that event. And the final was right here in Toronto at that stadium. That's the kind of partnership that works in our city. And I should mention, of course, it was on time, on budget. And this week it will be announced that it made a profit its first year. Our second principle and the second pillar is about Global Toronto. And Global Toronto, I think, is about recognizing the unique strengths that Toronto has. We're an international city, and sometimes we don't realize what a strength that can be economically. But people from around the world see Toronto as an international city and as a place from a business perspective to invest because we are so international. And I think that we must capitalize on that situation. One of the anecdotes told during our discussions at the Mayor's Economic Competitiveness Advisory Committee shows how unique the opportunities can be in Toronto. One of the members is Harry Pandy, who's the Chief Executive Officer at ICICI Bank Canada, one of the most prestigious Indian banks. He told us that his bosses in India had tasked him to recruit Russian-speaking Torontonians to train in their bank to go work at their branches in Moscow. I think that's an extraordinary story because I don't believe there's any other city in the world where that would happen. We have that amazing potential in Toronto, and we need to use it. Even regionally, I look at Toronto and Chicago as the co-leaders of the entire Great Lakes economy. And that economy is the third largest in the world, after only Japan and the United States. And I don't think we often enough think of ourselves on that scale. But we have a responsibility to take on a leadership role, just like New York, London, Paris, and Hong Kong have done to drive their regional and national economies. And in Toronto's case, it's very clear that we are driving Canada's national economy. We generate about 10% of Canada's total GDP, which is comparable in the United States to the contribution New York, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco make combined. Toronto's share of Canada's economy is equal to New York, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco in the United States. And that's why it's so important for us to take this leadership. The third pillar is called Creative Toronto. And it is in recognition of the fact that modern economies are about industries that use thinking and creativity in order to succeed. The creativity shown by our world stature universities, colleges, and cultural institutions. The creativity shown by our world-leading businesses like biotechnology, businesses like financial services, and businesses like information and communications technology. In Toronto, more than 148,000 people are now employed in ICT, which makes us the third largest sector in North America after New York and Silicon Valley. And we're growing by deliberately bringing that sector together to have its own strategy for success. A parallel would be what's now called our screen-based arts industry, and what most of us think of as our film industry. In 1979, the film industry had about $80,000 worth of business in Toronto. 80,000. By coming together to have an aggressive strategy as an industry, it's now a $1.3 billion industry 25 years later, which shows us what we can do when we're smart, we're strategic, and we work in partnership together. Which brings me back to the fourth pillar, One Toronto, whose focus is on social inclusion and opportunity for all. For me, it was very important that this pillar be built into our economic development strategy, because you can't build a great city if you build it only for those of us who work on Bay Street. You have to build a city where everyone is welcome. And I think that's a foundation principle of Toronto. Torontonians believe in equity and social justice, but we can't take that strength for granted either. Now, I don't mind if an investment banker makes $1 million a year. Good for her or him. But I want a young man or a young woman who lives in perhaps Melbourne to have the chance to work with a company financed by that investment bank, and when they do, to earn a decent wage and be able to afford to live in dignity in our city. Because a truly modern economy gives value to people's lives. Prosperity is created not just for its own sake, but to be shared so that no one is left behind. That's a basic Canadian value. And it's interesting that Richard Florida is coming to speak to the Canadian Club. He came and spoke to the Economic Development Committee when we launched our Agenda for Prosperity. And Professor Florida said that one of the things that struck him that showed Toronto's leadership was the inclusion of One Toronto as a pillar in an economic development strategy. And this is what he said. What we've got going here is pretty great, and we can make it even greater. The real challenge ahead of us is not only to make our city great, but to make sure our sister cities here in Canada, cities south of us in the United States, and cities around the world get wind of this agenda so they can learn from our leadership. In some ways, cities are already learning from Toronto. I'd just like to give a couple of examples. One of them is the battle against climate change, which is by far the greatest challenge that humanity's faced in my lifetime, and I think probably all times. Our record on environmental initiatives has earned us an active membership in the Clinton Foundation's International Climate Initiative. We're on the steering committee of the London-based C40's Large Cities Climate Leadership Group. Where nations aren't acting, cities are. The City of Toronto's budget for the fight against climate change this year is more than $118 million. The money will be well spent, but it will also enhance our worldwide stature as a leader in environmental protection. And we've already done so much together. We have an aggressive 70% target to divert waste from landfill, and we've changed our approach. That's why we're charging user fees on garbage, to ensure that people take advantage of the free recycling and composting. Our climate change strategy, called Changes in the Air, passed unanimously at Council last July. And interestingly, it's the #1 hit on the city's website amongst Torontonians, our climate change strategy. We have the Green Bin Program, the Green Lane Landfill. We have green roofs. We have the Green Economic Strategy. We have green development standards. And we even have Live Green Toronto. Exhibition Place will be a net zero energy consumer by 2010. And businesses are doing the same thing. Tridel and Minto are both building condominium and rental buildings respectively that meet the highest environmental standards, and in fact meet standards higher than the city's even setting in our green development standards. And you know what they're discovering? They make more money when they build a green building. And of course, I shouldn't forget to mention, because Councillor Ray is on the Parking Authority, we do have the largest collection of solar-powered parking meters in the world. There's one project I want to single out for special mention on our environmental agenda because it fits so perfectly with the agenda for prosperity. It's called the Tower Renewal Project, and it clearly shows how the agenda for prosperity can be achieved by linking together the themes of economy, inclusion, and the environment. In Toronto, we have nearly 2,000 concrete slab apartment buildings built from the late 50s to the 1970s, many with CMHC money. It's the largest collection of this type of building in North America outside of New York City, and they're terrible energy wasters. Some are owned by the city, but most are private. And we've learned that by recladding the towers with insulated material, we can lower their energy consumption by the equivalent of 1.2 million tons of carbon, which is about 5% of all the carbon produced in Toronto, simply by recladding these buildings. Best of all, it pays for itself in about 7 or 8 years. And it's one of the projects we're working on in partnership with the Clinton Foundation and the C40 Group. That's very impressive environmentally and economically, but it's not just about that. The project itself will create significant employment in technical fields that can't be outsourced anywhere. They're made in Toronto jobs, green-collar jobs. And the initiative will also allow us to rejuvenate the neighborhoods where these concrete towers are located. And if you look at the neighborhoods where the towers are, and then look at neighborhoods in Toronto where people are often marginalized or have low incomes, they're often the same neighborhoods. Why? Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. If you use Jane and Finch as an example. It was built started to be built in the late 50s and early 1960s when high-density development was encouraged on the explicit assumption that the area would be served by rapid transit. It's right there in the planning documents at the time. And here we are, nearly 50 years later, and there's no rapid transit to those neighborhoods. As a result, the neighborhoods became isolated from the mainstream and became places where people live in poverty. This will change as we redevelop these neighborhoods through the Tower Renewal Project, not just to clad the towers, but to also redevelop the land at the base of the towers, sometimes into public parks, sometimes commercially, to create employment opportunities and jobs. So at the same time that we rejuvenate the buildings and lower our environmental footprint on the world, we will provide opportunity, employment, right in the neighborhoods that need them the most. It's an amazing opportunity. We can teach the world how to reduce greenhouse gases by being socially inclusive. It was one of the things that struck me the first time I looked at the map that pinpointed all the neighborhoods where we might undertake tower renewal projects. If you draw lines to connect them all, you come up with a grid. That grid is almost identical to the city's Transit City plan. That plan came from a commitment I made during the 2006 election campaign to build light rail transit to parts of the city where transit service is inadequate. The plan was developed last year, approved for funding by the Ontario government, and this year the project will get underway with the first environmental assessments. 2 of the new lines are Jane and Finch, and one of the first to go ahead will be Finch. We're starting on the environmental assessment literally as we meet here today. So 50 years after high-density neighborhoods were built on the assumption there would be rapid transit, it's finally coming. I think this kind of leadership demonstrates what cities can do despite the very real fiscal constraints that we find ourselves in, not just in Toronto, across Canada. There's a growing recognition that we must start addressing these fiscal issues if we're going to meet the expectations Canadians have of Canada in the 21st century. Because to build a 21st century country, you must build 21st century cities. Cities that generate wealth, environmentally sustainable cities, cities with high-quality public services, cities where every single resident is valued and has the opportunity to participate in the life of their city. That's exactly the kind of city we're striving to become. But there's one thing missing, and that's the recognition of Toronto's stature in Canada and internationally by our national government, which must change. And it can change. And we know that because of the success we've had in developing a meaningful new relationship with the Government of Ontario. And we know that because of previous dealings with the federal government in negotiating investments related to immigration, housing, and public transit. To be fair to the current national government, it has continued some of the programs started under Paul Martin's leadership since it came to power in Ottawa 2 years ago. But cities have a long way to go before being properly recognized for the stake we hold in national prosperity. The province has come to the table in Ontario. They're our partners. They're investing in Toronto, and they're working with us to address the problems that amalgamation put in the way of our city. Last month, for example, Jim Watson, the new Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, came to City Hall, and together we signed the Toronto-Ontario Cooperation and Consultation Agreement. The agreement requires the province to consult with us on matters of interest to Toronto, and it also requires Toronto to consult with the province. There's never been such an agreement in the history of this country, and it shows the kind of partnership that is possible. And I'm quite confident that late this spring we'll reach consensus with Queen's Park and the Association of Municipalities of Ontario about which programs should be uploaded back to the province. Which raises the question, where's Ottawa? Finance Minister Jim Flaherty insists that the federal government isn't in the business of investing in cities. Well, I would beg to differ. Last year, Canada's 10 largest cities generated more than 50% of our GDP. And Toronto, Canada's financial capital, was the leader, and of course will continue to lead. We're the third largest financial district in North America. We're headquarters for 5 of the 6 national banks, 90% of Canadian-based foreign banks, and Canada's largest stock exchange. A prosperous, livable, successful Toronto is definitely in the national interest. For example, public safety. In Toronto, we've made a significant new investment in a new way of policing in order to make our city safer. And it's working. We've put more officers on the street, and they're dealing directly with the community. Crime is actually down. The number of shootings is actually down. And the number of arrests where a gun is used is actually up. But of course, public safety isn't just about law enforcement. It's also about investing in people, particularly in neighborhoods where young people don't have much, and a small number of them get drawn into gangs and guns. That's why we developed a community safety plan that prioritized neighborhoods for investment, and we're investing in those neighborhoods in partnership with business, government, academic institutions, and community organizations. For example, in partnership with the City of Toronto and Humber College, Microsoft is providing cutting-edge computer training to young people in a Rexdale strip mall. It's amazing how much they're learning. And you know what the number one question they ask? How do we learn to design computer games? The kids get it. I was talking last week at the launch, during the launch of Tech Week, to the president of an entrepreneurial Toronto information and communications technology firm. And he said to me that there was huge potential for Toronto to become a leader in the design and creation of computer games. The kids in Rexdale are ahead of all of us. All they need is a decent chance to learn some basic skills, and they'll get them if we all pull together. Microsoft is so impressed with what's happening there that it wants to expand the computer learning opportunity into other neighbourhoods. Foresters, the Ontario Science Centre and the city came together with youth living in Flemington Park to create community-based Flemo radio using state-of-the-art equipment, and the young people there are learning the skills they need to have a career in music. They're also very smart. Their very first live interview was with the Mayor of Toronto. Centennial College is a support of the Community Safety Plan through its Helping Youth Pursue Education program, which takes young people who've completely dropped out of the educational system and brings them back with free education opportunities. 20 participants from the 2007 graduating class of 115 enrolled in full-time studies at Centennial. Young people who totally dropped out who are now in full-time studies. It's an extraordinary success. And Ann Buller, the president of Centennial, can't be here today because she's at the college's Ontario Conference Award in London, accepting the Community Partnership Award on behalf of that program. It's these kind of innovative programs that will help make our Agenda for Prosperity a success. Public interest partnerships are a key to Toronto's economic future. But we need the federal government as a partner too. Not for the good of Toronto, but for the good of Canada. Cities are doing a lot on our own, but we can't achieve everything our residents rightfully expect without Ottawa being there to invest along with us. You can't tell me that the federal government doesn't have a responsibility for public safety. It's right there in the Constitution. Our law today allows any person who gets a permit to own as many handguns as they want. That's something Ottawa could deal with to make the streets of Toronto significantly safer. Yet Ottawa won't even bring into place a regulation to mark guns with their country of origin that they have agreed to in an international treaty. I think it's shameful. You also can't tell me that the federal government doesn't have a responsibility to fight climate change. Canada is a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. Yet the fight against climate change is happening in cities. And so much more could be done with federal investment. For example, if Canada had a national transit strategy like every other Western country. The TTC is the largest public transportation system in Canada. Many days, more people ride our subways, streetcars and buses than live in any other Canadian city. So you can't tell me that the federal government doesn't have a role to play in public transit in Toronto. Of course it does. Just like it has a role to play in supporting immigrant settlement. Immigrants don't come to Canada, they come to cities. And about half of them settle in and around Toronto. And it's right here, on our public streets, in our public parks, in our public schools, in our public libraries, that people truly become Canadians. There's a library at the New Wellesley Community Centre. It's a branch in the busiest library system in the world, based on the number of branches in the circulation per capita. It serves St. Jamestown, which is an inner-city community with a large immigrant newcomer and refugee population. And in the busiest public library system in the world, that branch, in its first month of opening, became the second busiest branch. That tells me that the young people in St. Jamestown were desperate for the learning opportunities that a public library gave them. And we can't build those public libraries and provide those learning opportunities without the ability to invest. And that's why big city mayors from across Canada came to Toronto to launch our 1 Cent Now campaign almost a year ago, which calls on the federal government to leave the equivalent of 1 cent from every dollar it collects in GST in the cities where it's generated, based on a simple principle. If you're going to invest in those things that support economic growth, you need a little bit of that growth to remain so you can keep investing. It's straightforward. The National Trade Centre is a perfect example at Exhibition Place. Was built under the first infrastructure program A third from the federal government, a third from the province, a third from the city. The provincial share has been long paid off. The federal share has been long paid off by income and sales tax revenues. The city share will never get paid off because the National Trade Centre doesn't pay property taxes and we don't have a share of the GST. And that means we don't have the money to invest again in that kind of facility. That's what this campaign's all about. And I'm very pleased at its success so far. It's picked up incredible support. The Big City Mayor's Caucus, FCM, virtually unanimous, the Canadian Senate's Municipal Finance Committee, Premier Dalton McGuinty and the Ontario government, the Quebec Union of Municipalities, and municipalities across Canada, literally from Aurora to Zora, from Wood Buffalo to West Perth. And at the end of last year, an independent poll by Environics concluded that 84% of Canadians are in favour of municipalities receiving the equivalent of 1 cent of the GST. There's a national consensus that investing in cities is the right thing to do. 1 cent of the GST would mean about $400 million a year to Toronto, in the 905 about $450 million, and nationally about $5 billion. What great cities, what a great 21st century country we could build with that kind of support from Ottawa. Issues such as homelessness, poverty, and the widening gap between rich and poor would be addressed by a robust economy with the capacity to provide both a living wage and strong social infrastructure. It's in all of our best interests for Ottawa to join us in the cause of prosperity, opportunity, and livability. No, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm an optimist and I'm patient. National governments can change their minds, or Canadians can change their national governments. Because people want their cities and their country to succeed. They understand the challenges we face, and they expect their governments, city, provincial, and national, to overcome those challenges in a practical and immediate way. Which is why our agenda for prosperity is so critical for the future. The future of Toronto, the future of Ontario, and the future of Canada. It promotes a direct, no-nonsense approach to building partnerships for success. Those partnerships must involve all of us gathered in this room. Those of us from business, those of us from labor, those of us from academia, culture, and government. Now, I know it might be difficult for some to be optimistic, given the worrying signs of a downturn in the global economy. Those, of course, are very legitimate concerns. But I remain an optimist. And on Bay Street, I'm bullish on Toronto. I'm confident in our city's future because we have something that's unique in the world. We have an incredible quality of life. We have an unmatched social diversity, over 100 languages spoken. In fact, books of over 100 different languages can be found in our libraries. 1/2 of Toronto residents, including me, were born outside Canada. 75% of all Toronto residents have a family connection to the world beyond Canada's borders. We have a highly skilled workforce, and we're the second fastest growing major employment region in North America. And together, we're building partnerships. Together, we're making investments to create wealth and opportunity. Together, we're starting to build a sustainable green economy that will make this city even more livable. Economic development isn't a value by itself. It's only valuable if we can ensure that every single resident of Toronto can participate equitably in the life of our city. We are all Torontonians, and everyone has their part to play. By working together, we will make Toronto the great 21st century city that we all want and deserve. A prosperous, livable city with opportunity for all. That's what the agenda for prosperity is all about, and with your help, we'll make it happen. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
you, Mayor. I'm getting signaled from the camera folks at the back that we've probably run out of time or run a little over. Most of the questions you've already answered.
I've already answered. That's good.
I think you'll be around for a couple of minutes.
Can you tell the press gallery I've answered the questions
if those one or two
already.
people might want to come up. What I'd like to do now is call on John Capobianco, who's a director of the Canadian Club, to thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alan. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to thank our mayor for a thought-provoking and inspiring speech today. Lyndon Johnson once said, "When the burdens of the presidency seem unusually heavy, I always remind myself it could be worse. I could be a mayor." I imagine there are days when running the city must feel like an enormous weight on his shoulders. It always seems to me that you have twin responsibilities as mayor of Toronto. To the citizens of your city, which is a responsibility all mayors have, but also to your province and your country. Since Toronto is such a large factor of Canada's economic growth, this is a burden most mayors don't really have to think about. The Mayor of Toronto does. Canada needs a healthy and vibrant Toronto. Ontario needs a healthy and vibrant Toronto. And of course, the people of this great city need a healthy and vibrant Toronto. Mayor, we appreciate your determination and vision to get this done, and to thank you very much for your time and your vision for Toronto. Thank you, Your Worship.
John, thank you very much. That wraps up our program.